To 5 seconds. Colburn shoots the flush and score! The Flyers tie it with 2.8 seconds remaining. Excellent for them. So the Penguins have had leads of 2-0, 3-1. Now Couturier ties it at 5. Sean Couturier with his second goal of the night.
Flyers Nitty Gritty presents the OMB Podcast, episode 96. And this is a special episode. I'm here with my buddy Anthony DiMarco of the fourthperiod.com. How are you, Anthony?
Not too bad, Isaiah. How are you doing?
All right, doing great. Hey, just a reminder, FlyersNittyGritty.com has a new sponsor, Jim's South Street, 400 South Street. Steaks and hoagies, definitely on anybody's bucket list of cheesesteaks. So check them out. If you live nearby and you can't get there, don't worry. They work with DoorDash. They can get it right to your door. Jim's of South Street, 400 South Street in Philadelphia. Anthony, there's a lot going on right now. And, last show we talked about, we had Bill Meltzer. I want to talk about the Flyers' 45th anniversary defeat of the Central Red Army team, and we wanted to do it early because right around mid-January it looks like the teams are going to come back. The league is still trying to work out details about coming back to play.
Yeah, well, I think at this point they're just trying to figure out the logistics, how the playoff format is going to look. Like, it seems like every couple of days the realignment changes, aside from the Canadian division that has been pretty much all but certain since the end of the bubble. But look, I still think it's kind of a moving target here. I don't think that there's one date set in stone. If I were a betting man, I would still kind of lean towards a February 1st start date with a 48 game season, because look, 48 games, the groundwork is already there. They've already done that twice in the 2 lockout shortened seasons, right, most recently in 2013. And at the end of the day, especially given the fact that at least to start, there won't be any gate revenue, I don't know how worth it would be, if they just added an extra 8 games, especially given the fact that you're going to be playing the same 6 or 7 teams over and over and over again. So you're just going to add an extra game for each team with that extra bit of scheduling. So for me, I'm expecting more of a February 1st start date, but I'm more anxious to see where they go in terms of the playoffs, because obviously the easy solution would be, well, the top 4 from every division make it. But, there are some divisions that are incredibly strong, like the East Division with Philadelphia, Boston, Washington, Pittsburgh, and the New York teams. And even you can make the case of the Canadian division being a very equal division across the board, maybe save for Ottawa. But then you look at the Western Division with the California teams, or even the Central Division, where it looks like the groundwork is there for Tampa Bay to just run all over everybody. So maybe they do something like the top 3 from each division make it, and then the rest go into kind of like a big pool. But aside from that, it seems that somewhere between January 13th and February 1st, we will get a shortened season started.
Yeah, and they got to work out the AHL rosters and having players available and what that would look like in terms of waivers, all that kind of stuff, because you guys are going to test positive this. They're not going to have a complete bubble, it would seem. So we'll see how that works out. But, the focus today, and a subject I've wanted to talk about with you, is looking back at what Chuck Fletcher tried to do going into last year, which I felt, and you can tell me whether you agree or not, was kind of like this last kick at the can for the Giroux, Voracek, if you will, JVR on the team. And then look what happens when they add some veterans on defense, get some stability in goal, and go from there. I was disappointed. Anybody who listens to the LNB podcast on a regular basis is probably tired of hearing me say how the Flyers are so lucky even to get past the Canadiens, and that 7-game series against the Islanders was one of the most unimpressive performances I've ever seen from a team that made it to 7 games. That's where I'm at with the team as we go into the offseason, and then, of course, Niskanen retires. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, entering the offseason of 2019, Chuck Fletcher had a choice. He said, give this group an actual chance to compete with a legitimate supporting cast and not this wishy-washy mix of borderline AHLers and guys who are too young to perform to their potential, like Hextall did for so many years, or blow it up and move on. He went with the former, which I believe was a good move, and the organization, even though it wasn't Fletcher's regime, owed it to that core to do so. What we saw in 2019-20, aside from that 10-game win streak or 9-game win streak, whatever it was in February, was a playoff team that kind of erred on the side of a bubble team. But I think we could all agree that they were a bona fide playoff team. They had stretches of really good play. They had stretches of really poor play. They were an inconsistent bunch that were, I would say, significantly better from the year before, but a lot of that had to do with the coaching behind the bench that changed that mentality. When we got into the bubble, aside from those 3 games they play in the round robin, I'm in lockstep with everything you just said. The win over the Canadiens was pretty much the most embarrassing playoff victory I've ever seen watching the Flyers. I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. It was not entertaining hockey. The only way the Flyers were able to win was by getting a 1 or 2 goal lead and trapping the Canadiens, which to me was just, look, you got to do what you got to do to win a hockey game, and a win's a win. But it was pretty telling to me that the quote-unquote first seed was playing a team that wouldn't even have sniffed the playoffs if it had not been for the pandemic. So I guess you can't say they squeaked by the Canadiens, but it wasn't an impressive victory by any stretch. They get into the second round against the New York Islanders, and if it had not been for the giant disparity in the play of the goaltenders, that series would have been done in 5 games. I think it was game 6 where Carter Hart was just playing brilliantly and Semyon Varlamov just couldn't stop a beach ball. Like, every shot the Flyers took went in. And then when game 7 rolled around and Barry Trotz put in Thomas Greiss, just a competent goaltender in the net, they got blown out of the water. So, look, I'm in full agreement to you that 7-game series was the most lopsided series that went the distance that I've ever watched from a Flyers perspective. Now, if there had not been a pandemic, I think the Flyers would have gotten just as far, but maybe they wouldn't have looked as bad doing so.
Right.
But all in all, they got as far as I would have expected them to get. And you know what? It was a success. It was a successful season, but it came with significant flaws. And this wasn't a point where, okay, our third pairing did us in, like in the 2010 Cup final. Or, the depth scoring just wasn't there in, let's say, the 2012 playoff series against the New Jersey Devils after the Giroux line got shut down.
Yeah.
Or the goaltending just wasn't up to par. No, it was a very obvious problem. And that is that the top guys can't put their big boy pants on, to quote Alain Vigneault. They do not have a game changer on this team. And I think that the center depth position became a real concern and was a big concern the whole season. So I thought at the bare minimum going into this offseason, the bare minimum, they would have gone out and gotten a guy like Max Domi, just a bona fide third-line center who could ideally shift to the wing if a Morgan Frost or, to a lesser extent, Nolan Patrick could kind of slide in there sometime over the course of the next season. But I think the more glaring hole up front, or not even a hole, just a problem, was that the guys making $8 and $7 million a year are not even worth that money, not even half of it at times. Now, I think that Jake Voracek is a guy that produces as much as we can expect from him, but is just kind of the victim of a very bad contract. We compared how many other wingers make over $8 million a year on Brotherly Pod last week, and I think there's like a handful, like 9. And the only guy in that group that you can say Voracek is leaps and bounds better than is Jeff Skinner. But at the end of the day, if you're making that kind of money as a winger in the NHL, you have to be a game changer. And Voracek is not. And it's not his fault. He was handed a big contract, so you can't hold it against him. But then you look at a guy like Claude Giroux. Well, Claude Giroux isn't even half the player that he was, let's say, in 2017-18, or even 18-19 for that matter. JVR, look, he still finds a way to score 18 to 22 goals a year, and you got to give him credit for that. But the coach literally has no place to play for him. More times than not, he was playing off of that top power play unit and on the third or fourth line where, not to say that he's a liability out there, but he's next to ineffective offensively. And then you get on to a guy like Sean Couturier, who is about as an elite defensive forward that you can get in the NHL, and that was very obvious that he won the Selke Trophy. But then it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say that once he crosses the red line and enters the offensive zone, he is anything but a game changer. So I think when you look at this Flyers team that is going in with relatively the same group that you could make the case as worse with the subtraction of Matt Niskanen and the lackluster addition of Eric Gustafsson, it's just kind of, it leaves a lot to be desired because you're going into yet another season to beat your head against the same wall that hasn't broken for the past 6 years.
Okay, but let me stop you there. We went a little fast forward, but that's okay.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. No, that's all right. What I'm trying to kind of ferret out is, let's just say they had a regular season last year without the pandemic. I listened to somebody like Bill Meltzer, we had him on the last show, as I referred to, and he always felt that the Flyers would have fared better, or at least performed better. I don't want to put words in his mouth, I'm just paraphrasing. Had they just been able to finish the season playing the way they were playing. Would they win 9 out of their last 10 or something like that? When I think they lost to the Bruins or something, I forget what their record was. They're really sailing along and trying, and hitting their stride, even without, Oscar and Nolan Patrick not having played. But had they shown up and gone out the way they had gone out, the issues that you're bringing up would still be there. These guys are another year older, and if it wasn't the cap supposed to be, what was in the neighborhood of, it was going to be 88.
Even more, yeah.
Yeah, and they were anticipating the money with the contract. That would be the year afterwards. Okay, what I guess my point is, and the reason I'm bringing this up is I think people have to come into the reality. Sure, you have to adjust to present circumstances with the cap being stuck at 81.5 this year and next at a minimum. But if they had a lot of cap space, Anthony, I submit to you that Chuck Fletcher would not be happy with what he saw last year in the playoffs, and he would go about the business of remaking this club along the lines of why he was hired by Dave Scott to begin with. And I think that would involve moving on from some of these contracts for players that you just discussed and being willing to take some money or a bad contract that they would buy out. Because again, if the cap is 88 or something like that, in other words, I think you'd just be a different scenario. And I think it's one that's more grounded in reality. And that's why I wanted to take a look at that. I don't think their attitude about what they think about this club prospectively, it has changed. They're adapting to circumstances, but in their heart of hearts, they can't be happy with some lead weight that they have on the team, and it doesn't augur well for them to move into that category where I think they're a playoff team, but are they really a cup contender with some of the baggage you're talking about coming from out of last year, and the fact that they lost Niskin, and only thing they've done is sign Gustafsson, who seems like Ghost 2.0.
Well, like, I'll throw it to you quickly with a question. It was you who had sent me the comments that AV made kind of regarding Claude Giroux following the exit in the bubble, correct?
Yeah.
And it was relatively underwhelming in the way he kind of felt. So,
yeah, because AV is very pointed in his remarks. And that's why I like to, like you mentioned earlier, big boy pants and changing their legacy and stuff like that. That, I mean, it's political in a way. It's for public consumption. It's euphemistic, but it sends a message. These guys, they know what's going on.
Yeah, so just to piggyback off of AV's comments, like, I think we saw all season long that AV wasn't shy to give his feelings on how the top guys were playing. And, this wasn't just kind of to your point, this wasn't just a problem that happened in the playoffs. Like, this was a problem in October, November. It was continually coming around or rearing its ugly head that, JVR isn't going. Giroux's inconsistent. Voracek kind of caught fire after Christmas, I want to say, and I would say that he was the best offensive player the Flyers had. But, like, this wasn't just a problem that showed up in the playoffs. And to your question about Chuck Fletcher is, I think absolutely it would have been a game changer if it was a regular circumstance and there was no pandemic and the economic crisis that has slapped the NHL in the face. Because we've seen that even good players, in quotations if you want to say, are being, their teams are having trouble moving those players. Like, look at the Tampa Bay Lightning. Like, look, Tyler Johnson isn't on a great contract, but he's still an adequate middle six forward any day of the week. There are teams that just can't move anybody, even for good players. And then you try and look at that from, let's say, a Flyers perspective that, okay, the two contracts everyone wanted gone were JVR and Ghost. And from the people I talk to is that JVR is completely unmovable, and Ghost is very unlikely to get moved, but probably could if you sweetened it. So I think absolutely Fletcher was kind of backed into a corner here where he couldn't do anything, and his hands were absolutely tied. That being said, I don't know how long he can realistically keep going down this road even after COVID, because I think that if just from a bird's eye view looking on this team or an outsider's perspective, I see a hockey ops department that acknowledges that the team as currently constructed is a playoff team every day of the week, but has no real shot to win a Stanley Cup. And the ownership in Comcast and Dave Scott has zero appetite for losing more money, especially given a pandemic, after 6 or 7 years of mediocrity from Ron Hextall and not making the playoffs, every second year, and a lot of, empty seats in the stands and just less revenue stream coming in. And then you get to what the Flyers are now, that Fletcher can't go into a rebuilding mode because for all the reasons I just mentioned, but can't improve the team because he knows that no matter what he does, as long as you have Giroux and Voracek and JVR making $7-8 million a year, there's no way you can actually construct a team that will compete for a Stanley Cup. And it just leads me to believe that they're kind of spinning their wheels and biding their time until these guys naturally just kind of run out their contracts and hope to God that the goaltender and the defense are still at a reasonable age and still playing at a very high level, that they can kind of reload.
Let me interject. They all also are hoping that some of these kids turn out to be as good, if not better, probably better, than many of the scouts think. And, it's a little bit of a, roll of the dice at the craps table.
I'll throw it to you. Like, I think that Joel Farabee is probably their best. Well, he's not even a prospect anymore, but he's a guy that when I see him play, especially how young he is and how good he is already, that you can say he's going to be a top line forward in the NHL. Not a big point producer, but he'll be a top line player. Aside from that, when you look at this prospect pool, is there any player that you say that's a first line player?
Out of the prospects?
Yeah. So anyone not currently on the roster?
Well, I would say that Morgan Frost has an opportunity to be, but I look at him as more of a second line guy, potentially.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I almost put Patrick in that category too, because, but he's not, he can't, but he really could be a game changer for them. Because if he came back, that's, again, we're rolling the dice at the casino with him, but if he pushed Hayes to a third line level role because he played that well, that does kind of change the picture and their arc. But that in and of itself is not really likely. I think their best overall prospect right now is probably Cam York.
And I agree 100% on Cam York. And this is the difference between, let's say, the defense / the goaltending and the forwards. If you look at the defense, if you wait a year or two and don't add anyone from outside the organization, I think that this defense will naturally grow into a cup contending defense. Because I think Provorov's the real deal. I think Myers is going to get better. Sanheim, he is what he is. I think he'll just be like an average second pair guy, which is okay. And then you get a Cam York, who he's almost tailor-made to play in the modern day NHL, a Igor Zamula. That defense is built to last and built to be good for a long time. The goaltending, well, Carter Hart, that's it. It stops and ends there. But the forward group, aside from Morgan Frost, and if you want to throw Nolan Patrick into that mix, you can. There's no guy that projects to be a top 6 forward in their system. Maybe you can throw in Forster, but I mean, that's kind of 5 years down the road.
Yeah, and Brink looks to me like he'll be a nice player who's like more like a mid-6 at best. Exactly.
Like Brink, I think a lot of people kind of misadvertised him as like Cole Caulfield Jr. Because I spoke to Mark Seidel a few times on a Brotherly Pod with Dan.
Yeah.
He used to be a scout for the Wild, draft analyst for CBC, ESPN, now runs his own scouting bureau. And he said that Brink is going to be kind of like that fringe second line, but like more suited for a third line player.
Mm-hmm.
He said that Morgan Frost, not that they're the same player style, but he expects him to have like the same impact as Rupe Hintz had in Dallas. As like that second line guy, 50, 60 points a year. He says he'll be a very strong power play player, kind of like a poor man's Danny Briere. And that's all good. And this would all be fantastic if, let's say, we were in 2017 when Giroux was scoring 100 points a year, Voracek was scoring 85 points a year, Wayne Simmons was still kicking around and still an effective player, maybe not still at his peak, but still playing decent hockey. Sean Couturier was just entering his own as a top-line center in the NHL. But it's like the timeline isn't matching up, and the Flyers drafted players to insulate the stars they already have. But they took so long that now you don't need insulation pieces. You need heirs to the throne, for lack of better terms. You need guys who are able to overtake Giroux as the top point producer, to overtake Sean Couturier as the top line center. Not now, but anyone who's watched his injury history and just, how things go in the NHL, you have to prepare for life after that when a player gets close to 30. So I think what's happening here is that you have a defense and a goaltending picture that's on one trajectory and a forward group that's on an opposite trajectory. And I think that's where kind of the problem lies here.
That's it. They're stuck betwixt and between. And because they didn't have that cap space to make the changes that I think we both agree that they would have made. Because last season was nice, it was a success, but it showed the guys that Fletcher was kind of covering for in his first full season weren't going to be good enough, and they were going to go through the transition, like you're saying. So now we have a timeline problem, and we have one section of the roster that's on once that really is kind of fading, and others that really haven't quite arrived. And then, of course, there's like a middle group with Couturier, Provorov,
Hayes,
and you know, the rest of them. And maybe you could throw Konechny in there as well. I mean, Konechny's probably the best natural goal scorer, and I think he'll be a nice player, first-line player, obviously made All-Star. That's to his credit. I think that depending on what happens this year, you might see a gambler come out in Chuck Fletcher. And this kind of gets us to the next phase of this, because I don't see them as a cup team. They'd have to make some deals in season. How the heck in the world are you going to do that? With so many games and so many days, you're obviously trying to reset the calendar and get in enough games within a certain period of time so they can return back to normal for the 21-22 season and finally put this thing behind them, get everything at the right time, and as opposed to what they're doing now, trying to condense everything. So, as you mentioned, the trajectories of the players aren't matching up. Normally, they'd be able to maybe trade their way out of it, take some salary to make things fit so the Flyers could project reasonably to be a certain kind of team that I don't think they can be right now.
Well, the other problem is not only is the trade market dead, especially when you take a look from, let's say, an upper echelon player perspective with big salaries, you're also going into a season that is going to be 48 to 56 games. And the Flyers are notorious slow starters. Like, this has been going on for how many years that they're slow out of the gate. And, you know, if last season was, let's say, a 48-game season, like, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but they may very well have been dead and buried. Because I think back to where they were middle of January. Is that about a 48-game? Like, is that about where 48 games gets you into regular season?
Yeah, right about there, I think, yeah.
And I think that coming out of the holiday break is like they kind of just face planted when they went out west, and they kind of only got their feet back in late January, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but I mean, that was like the low point of the season, but I think a lot of that has to do with adjusting to Vigneault, his methods, going through the bad times together as a team and kind of coming out of it. And don't forget, in that milieu, you have Oscar's diagnosis.
That's true.
And that was a big loss for them. And then there was the other aspect of, you know, Nolan Patrick, kind of, you got a feel for that he wasn't coming back. You know, before the first of the year, there was that hope, and a little bit after the beginning of the year, it started sinking in like, he's not coming back. So that's kind of like a 1-2 gut punch, even if the second one's a little bit more predictable. So I wouldn't put them down that much. They had a nice year last year, and I think they would have performed better had they been able to just kind of play it out. But I don't think those issues would have gone away. So where do we go from here is the question that we're going to end up with on today's show. Anthony, there's some players on this team that are going to be leaving in a couple years, and I don't know if people are in favor of signing players like this, you have expansion coming up. I would imagine Voracek would not be protected, nor would James Van Riemsdyk. Would they trade a player like Brink for Seattle to take JVR? You know, these are the scenarios that come up because at the end of the day, how do we as fans become armchair GMs and try to finagle a somewhat realistic scenario where the Flyers can get better and move forward and get these timelines more matched up so they have that realistic championship window?
Well, like, I'll take it kind of player by player. JVR, by all accounts, is unmovable, and I think the only chance they have to get out from him is in a deal like you just said. Like, say, okay, we'll give you a decent prospect and you take him, which I think is realistic, given the fact that by the time Seattle comes in the NHL, he'll only have 2 years left on his contract.
Yeah.
Voracek it's a dicey situation for me because of his contract, you will never get fair value for him in a trade in terms of a return. You're going to take a hit on the return because he makes so much money. If he was making, would you agree that he's kind of a $6.5–7 million player?
7, yeah.
Yeah, so if he was making that kind of money and maybe the term wasn't so egregious, let's say 2 years left at $7 million, I think you could get a decent haul for him. But because he has, 4 years left?
4 years, including this upcoming year. Yeah, he's good through 2024.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be tough for a lot of teams to chew on. So Voracek, it's almost like you might as well keep him, at least right now, because he's still a guy who will give you 65 points a year, you know. And when he wants to play, I think at least this year he showed that he was the most dominant player from a pure offensive perspective when he wants to play. And there's no secret that he had his run-ins with AV and whatnot.
He did improve defensively this year for the first time. He was going down like 3 or 4 years in a row with shots against. So give him credit in that regard.
Yeah, so I'm no Jake Voracek fan, but from Christmas on, and even in the bubble, I really didn't have many complaints about him. He played as well as I could have expected on both sides of the puck, like you just mentioned. Now you get into, so who's left at the top of, you know?
Well, you got Kevin Hayes. He's not going anywhere anyway.
Yeah,
so.
Kevin Hayes isn't going anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think he's a guy just for intangible reasons. I think you need him on this team. So that you're basically left, because I'm not going to lump Konechny and Lindblom into that group. I don't see a logical point to trading those two guys. I know a lot of people went kind of turned on Konechny, but whatever. I'm okay with Konechny, especially at his dollar value. So you kind of fall to Giroux and Sean Couturier, who they're both going to have their contracts expire by the summer of 2022. And most people would assume that their AAVs are just going to kind of swap here if they were to be re-signed. But when you get down to it, you know, to the nitty-gritty, no pun intended.
Yes.
You know, those are the only two guys that if you put them on the trade block will bring you back pieces that can make you reload and get those star players you desperately need. Because JVR, Voracek, they're not going to get you anything. You're basically just going to take them right off your roster and trade them for nothing. On defense, I don't think that maybe other than Sanheim, just based on Cam York and Igor Zamula, other than maybe him, there's no expendable piece on that back end that you can trade for a significant haul.
I think Sanheim's probably, I mean, Myers is almost untouchable unless he was, you know, what was required to get like Jack Eichel or something for Sean Couturier or something, you know, fantastical. I mean, other than that, Sanheim is the piece that would be more movable depending on how they play this year. With young defensemen, it can change in a half season.
Yeah, of course. And, you know, like we had Anthony Sanfilippo on Brotherly Pod a few weeks back, and he wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea of giving Sanheim, let's say, a $5 million contract.
Yeah.
Especially when, and again, this would all be different if you didn't have Cam York and Igor Zamula coming up the pipeline. Because Travis Sanheim is still a very good second pair defenseman, but he's not this like saving grace that a lot of people build him up to be. I hear a lot of, oh, put him on the power play in favor of Provorov. I don't want Sanheim the only defenseman out there on a power play.
Yeah, he's got more offensive acumen, but you know what? Anthony is watching the game. I'm a little bit older than Anthony, not much, but he sees what I see. What I see is a guy who repeatedly is soft behind the net in his own zone or in the corners, and it just so happens against the Islanders a couple of years ago, he made the same play when Cole Bardreau had his one flash in the pan for the Islanders, and then in the playoffs, same thing happened, and then you had a play behind the net that ended up in a goal against, and you can't have guys like that playing big minutes against really good players who make plays that are soft or they don't use their stick. You have to have some kind of plan to make a better play, and Travis he's only 24. It's reasonable to think when he's 26 or 27, he'll have a better plan and he'll make a better play, but that's probably why Anthony feels the way he does.
And this is no slight to say that Sanheim's a no good player. Like, by all accounts, he was a successful 18th overall pick. He's a second pair defenseman. That's great, but it's this, you have to differentiate from what is an untouchable piece and what is just a piece. You know what I mean? And to your point, I think that Provorov and Hart are as close to untouchable as you can get, and then right under them, you kind of have that Phil Myers and Joel Farabee where it's just like you kind of have to blow me away to get rid of them. And I'm talking about the younger pieces.
Right.
So you kind of, and I've zoned in on this so many times, that Giroux, Couturier, and Sanheim are the only expendable pieces on your roster that will get you significant value to kind of reload this thing and match up a timeline. And I don't see any way around it. I can't. There's no other scenario for me that, let's say, going into 2022 or 21-22, that this team could be looked at as a legitimate cup contender. Because I think it's fair to say that the economical landscape of the NHL won't be rectified for at least another 2 seasons. I think that's a fair assessment.
Probably.
So let's say that this season, they finish second in this new realigned East Division, and they bow out in the second round again, and it's just more of the same, which is what I'm expecting. I don't see a lot changing here. And we come back next October for 21-22, and everything's back to normal, and we just have the same team. But let's say Morgan Frost is the full-time 3C, and maybe Igor Zamula's on that third pair. Yeah, that's great that those young guys took that step forward, but are we accounting for the natural regression of a guy like Claude Giroux, JVR, Jake Voracek? Who knows where Sean Couturier will be at that point with his injuries and his reduced speed, and he's not a fast guy to begin with anyway. And it just seems that no matter how long they wait for these young guys to come up, they're only kind of balancing out the continued regression of these older players.
Well, yeah, that's right. And then it focuses in on the players that might be a vehicle for a change that you might be reluctant to make, that you may have to make. Obviously, G has a no-move clause. If he only has 1 year left on his contract, that like many things, is negotiable. If he feels like he could go to a team that would maybe have a better chance of winning a cup before he signs another deal, because he'll be, 33 then, and the 33-year-old Claude Giroux is, I don't know, it depends what's going on around him. I mean, the player that, to me, is worth the most amount of attention is Sean Couturier, because he'll be 29 going into his last year, and then I'm thinking to myself, it's going to be like they're repeating the same mistake with Sean Couturier that they did with Claude Giroux. And that's something our buddy Dan, a Flyer fan, wrote an article about it for Brotherly Puck. And I'm
Brilliant
sure,
article.
yeah, it was very reasonable. I know Dan gets emotional now and then, but he when he calms down, I'm just poking the bear a little bit. He writes some really good stuff. I mean, he wrote a fantastic piece about Sam Moran, and he's had a lot of really good stuff. You got to check out brotherlypuck.com. But anyway, I think that is, to me, that is the fulcrum. Sean Couturier will determine, and what they do with him, what the Flyers are going forward. Because, number one, you could tell AV looks at him as the paragon, this model that the Flyers want to follow going forward. G had his chance. It's not his fault. Things didn't work out. That's on the management. But we have to live in Realville. Realville is Sean Couturier is probably the best all-around player on the team. But at 29 with a year left on the contract, are we going to want to pay him, and then we're going to rely on him to be like the guy? When I rate him kind of like toward the middle of the pack in the NHL, I'll probably get a lot of slings and arrows for that as a first-line center. I think I put him around 14 or 15.
Yeah.
And I think, well, I mean, before the show we were talking about the merits or demerits of his offensive game, but I don't know if I want to pay a guy the $8 or $9 million that he might want to fetch with a Selke trophy in tow during his non-peak years, just as he's exiting his prime. Knowing he's not a big power play point producer, he's not the guy you want to have the puck late in the game because he's going to make this incredible pass or incredible shot that's going to be a game changer. He's just a great all-around player that impacts the game in a more subtle way outside of his penalty killing where he is outstanding. I think that is the crux of the matter. Am I wrong?
No, I agree, because let's say that they were to re-sign him. I think at bare minimum, he's getting 5 years at $8 million a year. And that's being generous, because he could very well get 8 times 8.5. But let's just say 5 times a best case scenario. You're still investing $15 million for the next 4 years in 2 centermen who are already 30 years old. And I don't want to hear comparisons that like, oh, well, you can invest that much money into centermen, into top 2 guys. Look at, the Edmonton Oilers. Look at the Toronto Maple Leafs. Look at the Pittsburgh Penguins. They pay a boatload for their top 2 centers. Well, Couturier and Hayes aren't Matthews and Tavares. They're not Crosby and Malkin. They're not McDavid and Draisaitl. And by that point, they're going to be 30, 31, 32, 34. So you're going to be paying 2 centers in their early 30s a combined $15 million. And, okay, you could say that over the course of those years, JVR is going to come off the books. And then I guess Voracek will for the last 2 years of those contracts. But I just don't see a way how you can responsibly invest that money into Sean Couturier based on how this team is currently constructed.
No, you become. I just thought of something. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
you become the Anaheim Ducks with
Getzlaf.
Yeah, with Getzlaf and Ryan
Kessler.
Kessler, right? Yeah.
Well, but I'll even throw it to you
not quite that bad, but I mean
similar.
Well,
like, I'll throw it to you because now you bring up Ryan Kessler, and that's a good segue. I see a lot of people that say, well, he won the Selke trophy, so now he's top 10. It's unquestioned. It's solidified. Ryan Kessler won the Selke trophy, I believe it was 2011, when the Canucks went to the Cup final. Was he ever regarded as a elite-level NHL center?
No, just a guy you really want to have on your team.
No. Ryan O'Reilly, let's say in 18-19, when he won the Conn Smythe, he won this, he won that. I think he won the Selke trophy that year. The peak of his career. Was Ryan O'Reilly ever considered an elite-level center in the NHL?
No, close, but not, he's not Crosby, Malkin, McDavid, Draisaitl, no.
Exactly. So, or let's give it to the most extreme example. Patrice Bergeron. He's won how many Selke trophies? The best defensive center of this generation by a landslide. But what people forget is when Boston won the Stanley Cup, he was second-line center to David Krejci. Was Patrice Bergeron ever considered an elite-level center in the NHL?
Him, I would say yes. Because of multiple.
Yeah, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to multiple Selke victories and championship and Stanley Cup final appearances, and him being really spearheading that offensively. So, and he's part of that line, obviously. So, yeah, I would say he is.
So, for me, it's like I don't see Sean Couturier quite like a Patrice Bergeron. I don't see him that good. I see him more in that Ryan O'Reilly category. And the thing is that his best years are behind him, I think. And if there are best years left, there's only 2 there. Because I think the speed factor is a concern, coupled with the several knee injuries he's had. And I just don't know if Sean Couturier 2, 3, 4 years down the road from now, coupled with Kevin Hayes 2, 3, 4 years down the road from now, can be that good. And then, the common argument I see here is that, well, by that time, Frost or Patrick, one of them will for sure be a second-line center, and Hayes drops to the third line. Okay, well, if Morgan Frost, let's say, give him all the benefit of the doubt, he hits the ground running, by the time Couturier's do a new contract, Morgan Frost will need at least $4 or $5 million a year if he's half as good as everyone says he is. So now you're going to give Couturier $8 million, Frost is going to get $5 million, and then Hayes is getting $7 million, and you're paying your 3 centermen a combined $20 million, and I don't know if they're worth that. This is kind of the problem where things start to get in, that you're paying your third line center $7 million, your top line center $8.5 million when he's kind of on the downturn, and then you kind of have your second line center stuck in the middle there. It just seems that it all kind of gets like, I don't know, it seems like it gets way too dicey for my liking, given the ages of 2 of those 3 centermen.
Listen, if they were in range of a cup, say in the next 2 years, and I really thought it could come together, I'd be singing a different tune.
I agree.
But I don't think that's the case. A lot would have to happen around them. And that's kind of why this show, maybe in some people's eyes, has devolved into an attack on Sean Couturier. And it's not meant to be that way. What we're trying to do is to avoid repeating the mistakes that were made by Ron Hextall investing in guys like Voracek and Giroux without helping them soon enough so you could take advantage of their prime years.
And that's what it comes down to. And the whole debate around Sean Couturier is pretty much as simple as you just boiled it down to. Do you think the Flyers can win a cup within the next 2 years? And if the answer is anything but a resounding, undeniable yes, you should err on the side of trading him. For me, I don't think about it twice. Given the landscape of the NHL, the economical landscape, and how tough it has become to make big dollar transitions, I don't see the Flyers making the necessary moves between now and the summer of 2022, when his contract expires, that they could be a realistical threat to win the Stanley Cup.
All right. So that being said, let's close it out with this. If you're going to make such a deal, you have to get a center because of all the questions that we're talking about. Claude Giroux is not going back to center unless he's on the third line at this point. And I don't even know if he's really in the conversation that's relevant here. If we're not sure about Frost, we think he'll be a nice player. Patrick, that's just, roll of the dice. And we're okay with maybe you can get a third or fourth line guy. But what are you going to do if Hayes kind of regresses back to more of a third line guy? And you're going to have a need to who you're going to go and trade Couturier for. And that, if you're going to say something like that, it's like, what are you going to get for him? And how much are you willing to augment that deal with what I mentioned earlier, the fantastical scenario of a guy like Couturier and Sanheim, let's go get fill in the blank.
So for me, ideally, I would look at guys like a Barkov or a Jack Eichel. Those are like the dream scenarios. But at the end of the day, I know people are probably going to get their bow and arrows ready to shoot me for this comment. I think that if Florida were to trade a Barkov or if Buffalo were to trade a Jack Eichel, they could fetch a far better return than Sean Couturier. I just think they could, based on the level of those players. So I don't see that as likely. If I'm Chuck Fletcher and I make the decision that I'm at least going to field offers for Sean Couturier, I look to the Winnipeg Jets, who you could make the case that they are a Sean Couturier away from being a bona fide favorite to win the Stanley Cup. You know, they kind of threw a Hail Mary this summer going back to the well, getting Paul Stastny. I don't know how good of an addition he's going to be. He had success with them a few years back, but he's 2 years older now. You know, Brian Little may never play hockey again.
Yeah.
You add Sean Couturier behind Mark Scheifele, and that's a dangerous team. And then you could make the argument that they could use a Travis Sanheim as well.
They need defensemen, no doubt.
Exactly. So let's say you look at Winnipeg, who I think that if you put Sean Couturier and Travis Sanheim on that team, they're by far the best team in Canada, and you can make the case that they're a favorite in the NHL. For me, I would be looking hard at Cole Perfetti. I think that, and this is plus, but that would be the main piece I'm looking at. And obviously a lot would have to go into scouting and what he does between now and then. But Cole Perfetti is a guy that I think slid in the draft, which was crazy. I've spoken to Mark Seidel about him a lot of times. He thinks he's an undoubted first-line center in this NHL sooner rather than later. He's a creative, dynamic, offensive player, and he would be a guy that matches up the timeline. Now, if you're adding in Travis Sanheim to the mix, could it be, and this is all me shooting from the hip, I have no inside intel on this, if you could do a Sanheim and Couturier for Perfetti and Line A type of trade, is that something you look at? Like, for me, that kind of trade, because I have no interest in, you know, prospects and draft picks and, you know, let's say a guy like Ville Heinola or Logan Stanley, kind of like these like shot in the dark random second round defense middle of the road D prospects. Perfetti for me is a slam dunk, and we've heard, you know, so many rumors regarding the link between the Flyers and Patrick Laine. If that was a deal that was even remotely possible, something centered around Sanheim and Couturier for Laine and Perfetti, that's kind of like the most realistic and ideal trade that I could think of off the top of my head. What say you on that?
I don't even know what to say about Cole Perfetti, except he's a bit of a wild card. There are some scouts that didn't like him as much, but it is kind of like a high-risk, high-reward scenario right now. A lot of it depends on what happens from here on out. And we're not talking about this season. We're talking about a scenario where we're a year out from now, and he's done X, and that X is as promising as a scout like Mark Seidel is imagining. That's a tough one. Who would you compare him to?
You know, Cole Perfetti.
Yeah, give me an NHL comparable. Is he an Aho? Is he a Sean Monahan? Is he a Barzal? I mean, what kind of player?
Well, he's an undersized, quick player who, you know, errs on the side of offense. You know, I remember Mark gave me a big comparable to him, but I'm drawing a blank. But I would say that he's more of a Matt Barzal type of player, the undersized, quick guy who you know, feeds off transition play. And it's one of these scenarios that, like you said, it's a high risk, high reward type of move. But, you know, I think he's more, and look, I haven't watched him a whole lot, so I base my opinion a lot on what, you know, Seidel and other scouts I know say about him. But if he's anything like a Matt Barzal type of game changer, which I'm kind of thinking right now, is that not a risk worth taking, especially if you can get Line A along with that?
Well, that has to be part of it. I mean, it has to, because that does set up Winnipeg very well. So
exactly.
So it would definitely have to be a situation where this guy is poised to become the next great fill in the blank, but then Winnipeg, with the timeline that they have, with the players like Scheifele and
Wheeler?
No, Wheeler and
Ehlers, Connor.
Ehlers, Connor, right. So they're ready to win in goal, and they have a lot of good things going for them. So, yeah, I mean, if you're going to hand that on a silver platter with a goalie like Hellebuck, you better hit. You can't mess that up. It's just a basis for comparison. In his draft year, I think Barzal had 88 points in 58 games, whereas Perfetti had 111 points in 67 games or something like that. But, of course, the Western League versus the OHL, it's a little different. So,
yeah, the Western League is more of a hard-hitting, tougher defensive league. So
yeah.
So, look, a lot of this depends on what happens with the Flyers between now and whenever a trade deadline might be. But let's say that I think the only way they would make a deal in season, of that magnitude, is if they completely, face plant out of the gate and they're not going to make the playoffs. But would that be a trade that you would consider? Is that a deal worth making?
I'd have to get more back. If you're talking Line A, that's a big deal. When we remove a piece like Couturier, who's kind of like the heart and soul of the team in the eyes of AV, and then a player like Sanheim steps in and is probably at least their third best defenseman, if not their second, after Morrissey. That's a lot. So.
And this is plus, but I think Perfetti, Line as the starting points. Maybe you get back one of those defensemen that I just mentioned, like a Ville Heinola or a Sami Niku, a young defenseman who, not an incredibly high ceiling, but can be a stopgap for when York and Zamula are legitimate top 4 NHL guys. And I think Zamula has more of a shot to be a third pairing guy. But I think York at this point is almost a slam dunk. Because I think that I don't know how many teams are going to shell out. Let's say if we were to go more towards a hockey trade type of deal for Sean Couturier. Do you think Florida would do a 1-for-1 swap with Barkov?
I mean, the way that Coach Q likes to play the game, I don't know if he has the foot speed, and he's not going to get any faster. And that's, obviously one of the other concerns that I have personally. I mean, I don't know what would motivate them to make that trade, because Barkov is going to have to get paid as well, but he's younger. And he is more of a well-rounded threat in the offensive zone. He also has a no-move clause, so that would make it very difficult. At this stage of the game, I like Barkov better than Couturier because he translates on the power play. He's a threat when he goes over the blue line. He's in the offensive zone, more so than Couturier. And if we had defensive problems around Barkov, then I would want a more defensive-oriented guy. It's just, you're trying to match the strengths and weaknesses of the respective teams in terms of putting the players in the right spot so there's a fit. There's always a fit for good players, but sometimes there's a better fit for a given situation. And that's where we're at right now with the Flyers. The Flyers don't seem to have a lot of explosiveness in their lineup. A good, steady bunch, and they need some catalyst as Giroux declines, and we cross our fingers that Morgan can be some kind of facsimile of G. But that's a maybe. So that's kind of where that's why we're talking about Couturier in the manner that we are, as a further rationale.
And you brought up the fact that Barkov's game translates more to the offensive side of the puck. And we were kind of talking off air here about if you use, let's say I'll give reference to it, the A3Z performance tool, that it tracks players' entries and exits and shot contributions. Aside from Couturier's shot assists, he is lower than the 70th percentile in almost every category that relates to those. Shot contributions, 44th percentile, controlled entry percentage, 51, controlled entry per 60, 65 percentile, controlled exit percentage, 44th, controlled exits per 60, 65th. These aren't bad numbers, and his shot assist is incredibly well, but, do these tell you a story that you can't see with your eyes?
I think so. It correlates kind of like a really good all-around player who impacts the game all over the ice, but with what the Flyers need and what the Flyers have around Sean Couturier, I don't know if it's necessarily the best mix for the Flyers to win a cup. And I'm all about the uniform and the team winning the cup and doing what it takes. So that's what the Flyers' philosophy was always about. When Keith Allen got this thing rolling way back in the day, their rationale for making transactions was, especially, not for every, sending a guy to the minors, but when they made major trades or filled in the draft with trading a guy like Bill Clement to get Mel Bridgman, the idea was, is this going to help us get closer to our goal of winning the cup? So obviously the bar is going to be high if you're considering trading Sean Couturier, and that's the last time I'm going to say that. But I think that has to govern what you do as opposed to your feelings about a particular player, be they objective or subjective. That's where I'm coming from. I think you feel the same way. But if you have to look at the whole scenario, the whole milieu, Drew's aging out, may not be back. One of Voracek or JVR may be taken. You might have to take them and add something to them when they were prospects so we can get them out and get some cap space for the expansion draft. How are you going to move this thing forward? And that's what we're trying to do, right?
And that's the other thing, is that people think that guys like you and myself and, let's say, Dan are crapping on Sean Couturier when we say we don't think he should be back, but it's actually the polar opposite. It's that he's such a good player that he's the only guy that they could parlay into assets that makes this thing sustainable. Because I don't think it's reasonable to assume that he's going to be the same player in 3 years. I just think that there's a lot of things going against him. And when he needs that new deal, and look, if he had more cost certainty, let's say he had just signed this contract and he had another 5 years left on it, I don't think we would be having this conversation.
Well, no, it's one of the best contracts in the whole league. It has been for quite a while. But it took him a long time to round into the form where he kind of outperformed his contract, if I could use that expression. But now it's going to be payback time in 22, 23, and then he'll be 30 years old, and it's we've seen this act before. We don't want to go there.
And again, it's not his fault, much like it was not G's fault for all those years where he was putting up 80, 90, 100 points a year, but the team never did anything of substance or anything substantial because there wasn't a good supporting cast. And I don't know if the Flyers supporting cast, even with all these prospects, is going to be as good as people think they are to, make up for the regression in Couturier and Hayes' play down the road. And I've said this a few times over the past couple weeks, but I think why a lot of people don't want to acknowledge this is because after all these years of rebuilding, at this point, you were supposed to be at that cup contending stage. And if you're trading Couturier, you're at least acknowledging that you're going to take a step back for minimum a year. But what I ask you, Isaiah, is that this rebuild started after they bowed out in 7 games to the Rangers in 2014.
Yep.
Is this team just marginally better than that one?
I think they're a clear notch above, and they project better because the nucleus is younger. But you don't really have established stars like that club did with Giroux and Voracek and even Simmons. So you can make that argument. Although I think the goaltending situation looms very large in the discussion. I think the overall balance of this team is superior to the present team. But you don't have the outstanding contributors because some of those guys have the same name and the same uniform. They're just not the same players.
And for me, like, I have no doubt that they're a better team now. But I don't, like, if you would have told me in 2014 when this nonsense started that we would do all this just to get this team, do all that just to get this team, I would have said, well, screw that. We might as well just try and maximize these years of Giroux, Voracek, and Simmons, and then, you know, when we hit the wall, then you rebuild from there.
Absolute bull effing bleep. No way. That's it, you know. And I don't want to repeat the mistake, like I said. So, and I think we're going to wrap it up there. We're not trying to slag on Sean Couturier. It's just, I don't mind kicking the can down the road a couple years, let some of these other kids bring up their level of play, become the new leaders, and not sink all that money in. But like I said in the very beginning, had we had the $88 million in cap space, I wouldn't be talking about doing anything like this because the Flyers would have had more flexibility to make more dramatic changes around Sean Couturier. So a lot of this is necessitated by the current realities of the pandemic and what happened, and I think it really screwed the Flyers out of a legitimate cup chance.
Yep, I agree.
In the next year or two. I think it's just going to have to wait, and if it is going to have to wait, make the best moves going forward so they do have a chance with all these other players that are natively grown in your culture. And that's just the way it goes. It's tough luck, but I don't want to go through what we went through from 13 on. It's not worth it.
So to just put a bow on it,
yes,
where would you like to see Fletcher go? Like, what direction would be ideal for you?
Well, just for this year, just do what you can to get, unless he has some resurgence, get Ghost out of here, get some cap flexibility. Maybe get a veteran defenseman and could take some hard minutes. I think they still lack that guy. And toward the trade deadline, if they have said flexibility, even with a veteran defenseman, what have you, they're going to have to get somebody to spruce up the power play because that's a problem. I don't know how much Gustafsson can really add to what they have right now, but I imagine that when Fletcher leaped on that opportunity to give him $3 million for 1 year, that he said, this guy can fit right in on our power play and make a difference at the very least, even if he's ghost-like on defense, no pun intended. But I just think that's about all he can do for this year. And moving forward and addressing the broader topic, I would be looking to see if I could get some kind of group of players to take this thing, to put the Flyers in position in 2 to 3 years down the road to really have a great team and maybe just be a playoff team for a couple years, but younger, without squandering assets and being in a better cap position to pounce if an opportunity arises, knowing that Carter Hart is here. If he's settled in, they're going to have to pay him. They're going to have to pay, make a decision on Sanheim. There's a lot of decisions about players that need to get paid. You need the flexibility.
Yeah, and that's another thing is that for all these deals that may very well expire or get traded like a Ghost and of JVR, there are still the impending raises of Carter Hart, Joel Farabee. Eventually Phil Myers is going to need that new deal. There's already places for that type of money to go. It's not like this money's just going to evaporate and we're always going to have this cap space. It's like, aside from Claude Giroux, which theoretically that money would just transfer over to Couturier if they were to re-sign him, there's not a lot of money freeing up here to make room for all these kids.
Well, now it just depends at what level these kids are at. They may supplant people that we're looking at on the roster who are relatively young if they're better. Those might be the new trade assets.
Yeah,
you just don't know, but you can't shuffle guys like Voracek and Van Riemsdyk because nobody wants them.
Yeah, it's they're in a dicey spot, and
they're a nice team. They're a nice team, a lot like 2013. I think better, but really, how much progress have they made? It's been glacial.
Well, that's the whole thing, is that no one denies that this is a playoff team. No. Like, no one. And, like, I would be relatively shocked if they don't make it into the playoffs. But beyond the first round, I don't expect anything. I mean, Jim from Angry Negative has brought this up numerous times that people don't want to talk about because we live in an analytical world, but the lack of toughness and physicality on this team, I think, doesn't get talked about enough.
Well, I think there's something to that. There's no question, but you can get those guys.
Of course.
Yeah, so I'm less worried about that than being able to get a goal when you really need one to really change the complexion of the game. There is simply no one on the roster outside of Konechny, potentially, who can be that guy. I'll give him a mulligan for what happened in the playoffs. I can't dwell on things like that. Following the game now, I'm at my 51st anniversary of following the Flyers and the NHL. I've seen enough guys come up zero for years on end, and all of a sudden, boom, they break through and they're a different player. There's very few Justin Williams who seem to have delivered from the very beginning,
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, the Konechny thing, like, I know a lot of people got on his back, and like, I never saw the point of dwelling on that. Like, I think that Konechny is a nice player. I think he'll be a first line player for a long time in this league, and he just came up snake bitten. He's not a problem. Like, he's not a guy that, for me, he's on a good value contract. He's at a good age. Like, there'd just be no point to trading for him unless it was like a crazy good trade, type of thing. So barring anything like substantial, he's not a guy I'd be rushing to get rid of by any stretch.
No. I mean, you could spitball all day with some of these guys, but I expect TK to be a 30-goal, 70-point kind of guy. Hopefully going forward, and depending on who he's playing with, could be more. So, well, and I think we're going to wrap it up right there. That's a lot of spitballing in one day, but I think we presented a scenario that's grounded in reality. And it's not meant to take any fun away from anybody, but just to kind of a little food for thought as we enter into the season. And we're going to have a regular show. We're going to have Russ Cohen on. We're going to talk about the World Junior Championships and whatever the NHL comes up with as far as an agreement. That'll come up this weekend. And where can people catch your work? I know you're with the Flyers correspondent for thefourthperiod.com.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at DiMarco25. I write at the Fourth Period. I'm here and there on SiriusXM Radio as well, sometimes on Sportsnet Radio. But easiest place to find me is definitely online at thefourthperiod.com.
Excellent. And you can yell at me at Isaiah, ISAIAH _520. Yeah, people do yell at me. Isaiah, don't forget the _520. And, of course, you can follow the OMB Puckcast at OMB Puck, at OMB Puck. Please give us a 5-star rating if you like our show, especially on Apple Podcasts. And we're on so many different podcast platforms. Just rate and subscribe. If you subscribe to the show, it really does help. It moves us up the charts when people are looking for Philadelphia Flyer podcasts. Tune in, Stitcher. We have a YouTube channel. Of course, we're featured on FlyersNittyGritty.com. And we'll catch you sometime this weekend. Appreciate you following us for today's O&B special. Until next time, take care.